Today we're going to talk about the first group in our second semester, and this group is known as the animals or mammals. And an animal is any organ that moves from place to place in its environment in order to get food. So something that can move from place to place is given the term modal, motile, mobile, and that's what that word means. It means to be able to move from place to place. And this is as opposed to the idea of being sessile. Now, something that cannot move is something that has to have the environment come to them. And they are specially designed to take advantage of the fact when the environment does come to them. So you have mobile, which is illustrated here by the dog, and sessile, which is illustrated by these coral reefs. The second major concept in the animal kingdom is the concept of symmetry, and it's important to understand the concept of symmetry. There are several kinds of symmetry, and the first kind is called bilateral symmetry. Bilateral symmetry means that you can cut an animal in half in one plane only and produce two similar halves. And this crab here is an example. If you cut him in half right in the middle, you have a right half and a left half, which are very similar to each other. The second kind is called radial symmetry. In radial symmetry, an organism can be cut in half in several different planes through the center and produce similar halves. The last is asymmetry. Asymmetry is when it's not possible to cut the organism in any way to produce two similar halves, two or more similar halves. So here's examples of bilateral symmetry with this butterfly or moth, radial symmetry with this starfish, and spherical symmetry, which I didn't mention in my previous statement, but is a form actually of radial symmetry, is not really different from radial symmetry. Now, vertebrates are animals that have backbones, and invertebrates are therefore animals that do not have backbones. And this is a major distinction in the animal kingdom between a large group of invertebrate animals without backbones, and we will talk about invertebrates extensively in the last 2 weeks of this quarter. And then the first 5 weeks we will be primarily talking about vertebrate animals. Now, vertebrates, however, are the smaller of the two groups and only make up about 3% of all the animals. Now, in the vertebrate group are mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. And this will be 4 weeks we will be talking about. We're talking about mammals today. Next week we'll talk about birds. The next week we talk about reptiles and amphibians. And then the 4th week we talk about fish. So here's the distinction between vertebrates on the right and invertebrates on the left. And so you have a large group which amounts to 97% of all animals on the left side. And then on the right side, the animals involved in there amount to only 3% of the total. So vertebrates are animals with backbones. And in that backbone, there's a spinal cord, and they have a brain, a skull, as I said, a backbone. And a backbone begins phylogenetically as a notochord. And a notochord is a flexible rod, which is the precursor to the backbone. The backbone is generally made up of segments called vertebrae. The notochord, however, is a single flexible rod that makes up the backbone. Now, these animals primarily have an endoskeleton. An endoskeleton is a skeleton that's underneath the skin, where the bone and cartilage is underneath the skin. In week 5, we'll be talking about arthropods. Arthropods are not vertebrate animals, and they have an exoskeleton. They wear their shell on their outside of their body, and that's what distinguishes them from the previous 4 weeks. We will be talking about all animals with endoskeletons. Another thing about vertebrates is most of them are tetrapods. All of them are tetrapods, Many of them walk on their four appendages. Humans and birds do not walk on their four appendages. Humans or birds are bipeds, and so they walk on two of the four appendages that they have. So vertebrate animals have bilateral symmetry. They're called the phylum Chordata, which is from the notochord. A phylum is a big group of animals, or a big segment of animals. And then the subphylum is vertebrata, that distinguish it from invertebrates. Now, mammals are distinguished from other vertebrates in the fact that they have warm blood, hair, and they produce milk for their infants. So the mammals, which we'll talk about in the next few slides, are vertebrate animals that are separated off from other vertebrates like reptiles and fish in the fact that they are warm-blooded, they have hair, and they produce milk for their young. So this is an example of a mammal. This is a fox. It has a skeleton, which is an endoskeleton, and the pattern of skeleton for mammals is very similar. There's, differences, obviously, say between an elephant skeleton and a human skeleton, but there are general pattern similarities in the skeleton. They always have two pairs of limbs, and some it's arms and legs, and others it's four legs. They all have some hair to some degree, and the females produce milk for the young. And this milk is produced by a special gland called a mammary gland. Mammals are warm-blooded, and the term for warm-blooded is homeothermic. And what this means, it doesn't necessarily mean that the blood is warm in terms of, how would you define warm? But what it means is that the animal regulates its temperature by internal means. It is cold-blooded animals, as opposed to warm-blooded animals. Cold-blooded animals assume the temperature of the environment that they're in. Warm-blooded animals control the temperature and keep the temperature regulated by internal means, and so the external environment has little effect on their internal temperature. Mammals also, at least as some groups of mammals, will spend a winter in a dormant state known as hibernation, or they hibernate. Bears are an example of a group of mammals that hibernate. They have lungs. They have a diaphragm which powers their lungs and helps breathe. They have a four-chambered heart, and these animals all have these things in common. Mammal reproduction is specialized. There are the placental mammals, which are the mammals whose young receives a nourishment from what's known as a placenta internally before the animal is born. They produce by sexual reproduction, which requires the contribution of a male and a female parent. They, as the name implies, they have a placenta. The placenta is actually a tissue that's an aggregate that is formed from both cells from the child as well as cells from the mother. So the placenta is a unique tissue, and the tissue that's makes up the placenta actually comes from both the mother and the child. There's a fluid sac in which the embryo rests while it's in utero, and that fluid sac is called the amnion, or the amniotic fluid, and it protects the infant from shock. And then there's those, depending on the animal type, there's the time from the conception, which is the union of egg and sperm, to birth, and that time is known as the gestational period. During that time, nutrition is supplied to the embryo or the infant or the baby by the placenta through what is known as the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord comes from the placenta to the child or multiple infants and feeds the infant food. The blood from the infant goes through the umbilical cord to the placenta. There's an exchange of nutrients. There's an exchange of oxygen. And then it comes back and feeds the cells of the embryo in utero. And then the infants are born alive. And this being born alive is called viviparous. Now, there are also mammals that do not reproduce by means of placenta. Some, very rarely in the mammals group, they actually produce eggs. And that's called, when you produce young that are born from eggs, that's called oviparous. This is extremely unusual in the mammals. And then the other option is what's known as marsupials, where the infant is born outside the body. It crawls up to a pouch-like apparatus or pouch-like organ and gestates in the pouch. And so most of the gestational period when the baby is being developed is outside the body in this pouch. And then the infant then emerges from the pouch born alive. And this is what's known as a marsupial. We're going to go through some various mammals, and we'll take a break here in just a minute, but we're going to go through some various mammals and talk about different aspects of these mammals. The first of these is the solitary aardvark. This is the order. Now, remember, we had phylum, subphylum. The next step down is order. And this order is Tubulidentata, which means a tubular snout or a tubular jaw, which has the teeth in it. And the aardvark is the only member of this order. And it's the tube-toothed anteater. And these animals eat ants, and that's what their diet is. The next of the order is the I have trouble pronouncing these, Proboscidea. This is animals, you might recognize the term proboscis. And the proboscis is like a tube or a snout, and the order Proboscidea is animals with trunks, such as the elephant. The elephant is distinguished because it's the largest living land animal. There are several types. There are the African bush elephants, which live in the plain areas, the savanna areas of Africa. There are the African forest elephants, and then there are the Asian elephants. Elephants are also distinguished by the fact that they have tusks, and these tusks are large in size, enlarged incisors. And these incisors are important because they're made of ivory. And prior to the extensive use of plastics, ivory was used for a lot of things, including the rims of glasses and various other jewelry. And elephants suffered a great deal because of the use of ivory in various situations. The next order is the order Sirenia. The Sirenia is the sea cow. The sea cow is called a cow because it grazes in the oceans much like a regular cow that we're used to. And the sea cow, as you can see, looks like a big walrus or otter that swims underwater. They are huge animals. When they come out of the water, they're very graceful in the water. When they come out of the water onto the beach, they lose a lot of their grace. One is called a dugong, which has a forked flipper that it uses to move through the water. The other is known as a manatee, which does not have this forked flipper. So you have two types of sea cows. One type of sea cow is called the dugong, and it has a forked flipper, and the manatee is the other type, which does not have a forked flipper.